this line here now, that is the pivot point. This is the first point of support. Remember how we talked about this bar is going to be support for the reversal bar, because these people are going to start buying. Well, now when you enter, this is why you don't necessarily want to enter at the close of this bar. You can, and this is why sometimes people say that I cost them a trade because the market didn't pull back to the pivot point. And it's not going to always pull back to the pivot point. But, and this is a point I need to clarify, because many traders, they get confused on this when I say it depends on what the market does first after the pivot point is created. If it hits resistance first, the odds are high that it will not break out above the high or close above the high. This is the swing high now. This is the swing low now. The way a market moves is a process after a breakout. Now this is considered a first level breakout, a pivot creation, because this bar broke out from this bar. The bullish bar broke out of the high of the real body of the bearish bar. And after a market breaks out, whether it breaks out from a pivot or it breaks out from a high, the first thing that usually happens is called a reaction, meaning that price will back up and test. That's why it's called a test. Will back up and test this level, bounce off, and that bounce provides the swing, the power. It generates the power, the trampoline to bounce price up. When that bounce does not occur and the momentum alone takes price up into the area of resistance, if that happens first before the test or retrace or reaction back, most of the time that is a good signal that price is not going to break out until it comes back and makes this test. Now that does not always happen, but right now we're just covering the basics. But in the majority of the times, this is how it will work. Now I hope I've covered everything about a bullish swing reversal and why you should enter on a pullback or what's called the reaction. And yeah, that reminds me, I should make another point also. What's the difference between a reaction and a pullback? I'm sorry, a reaction and a reversal. What is the difference between a reaction and a reversal? A reaction is going to come back and test before a pivot reversal back down. If price goes up to this level and forms a reversal bar or forms a pivot before it comes back down and tests, you don't want, this pivot is nullified. You don't want to enter here now at this pivot point, because now the strength or the momentum is downward. You only want to enter in the direction of strength. So right now the direction of strength is up once we have this reversal or pivot bar. If price comes back on a retest or retracement, the momentum is still up, because that is the direction of the swing. However, now if we get this type of formation, if we get a bearish pivot and then price comes and touches us, we don't want to enter now. See that this bearish pivot reversal up here nullifies this bullish pivot reversal down here for sake of if we want to enter a trade. Okay, that about covers it for bullish swing reversals and pivots and the actual creation of the pivot point. So I hope now we understand the difference between the actual pivot and pivot point. I forgot one last thing. Yeah, and that reminds me. In the context of a swing, this reversal bar, now it's called the pivot bar. And I'm reminding of that because some of my students have problems. They get confused on the difference. Okay, this is now the reversal bar is now the pivot bar. It's just a reversal bar when we're talking about just two bars. But in the context of the swing down, it is the pivot bar. And it is the combination of the pivot bar and the swing bar here that creates the pivot point. And the low of the pivot bar creates the range of the pivot, meaning that from the pivot point to the low of the bar, and this is an outside bar, so it made a lower low than the swing bar, but that doesn't matter. As long as it closes high, closes higher than the open here. If it, in a case that it did not make a lower low than the swing bar, then our stop would go below the low of the swing bar. But in this case, our stop would go below the low of the reversal or the pivot bar. Okay, now we have it. Reversal or pivot bar, pivot point, swing bar, range of the pivot from the pivot point to the low. And so anywhere within here until price breaks below here and closes below here, this bullish pivot is still in play, meaning that it's still in effect. The upward momentum is still in effect until we get a close below here. But now if we get a bearish reversal downward before price even makes it back down to the pivot point, once we see that bearish, once we see this bearish pivot reversal, this pivot down here, this bullish pivot, is no longer in play. The bearish pivot would then be in play. Okay, next we'll talk a little bit more about a bearish pivot reversal. We're going to talk next about bearish pivot reversal.